You're listening to episode 192 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Matt Lowry joins us to speak about how our communities, particularly our secular and skeptical ones, are evolving with the rapidity of punctuated equilibrium. Our groups are evolving, but with evolution, which involves change and difference, we need to be open that it may not all be bad. Diversity, we continually say here on this podcast, is a strength. So how does this happen? And what does it mean when you're neck deep in the difficult transitional stages? Matt Lowry is a high school physics teacher with a strong interest in promoting science education and critical thinking among his students and the population in general. He is a self-described skeptic, someone who believes in Carl Sagan's adage that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. His blog, The Skeptical Teacher, is to allow Matt to expound upon various topics related to skepticism, science, and education. So sit back, relax, and have a good point. And a returning guest today is Matt Lowry. Matt, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So today we're going to talk about the evolution of the communities we belong to. And Matt, one of the reasons I'm having you here to talk about this is you've been recently fairly well embedded in various communities in skepticism and our critical thinking groups. And you've seen some changes in those over time. Particularly recently, there have been some splits and transformations. And I want us to talk a little bit about that and what some of the key characteristics are of this groundswell that leads to events that seem to create different branches in a tree. And I wonder if you could talk for a few minutes just about what some of your thoughts are on some of the things that lead to these divisions.
From my perspective, I think a lot of it actually just has to do with basic human nature. I mean, one of the things that's, I think, important to understand is that skeptics and critical thinkers and debunkers and woo and all that stuff, we're human, just like everybody else. And we have the same, human failings and biases and whatnot as everybody else does. And like everybody else, we tend to not see our own biases when we are confronted with something which is a core part of our belief system or something that is emotionally dear to us or whatnot. I think using that as kind of a baseline, you can start to understand a lot of the changes over time, a lot of the evolution of the skeptical movement in the last couple of years. And I think there's a couple of things that are going on here. I think in one sense, a lot of what we've seen, it's a difference between big personalities. You get big personalities, you get big egos, and sometimes they conflict. And sometimes when they conflict, they do so in a not necessarily the most pleasant manner. Sometimes it is. Sometimes the disagreements are civil, and sometimes they're not. I think as a corollary to that, what you get is because you have these big personalities, right? You have the Richard Dawkins, you have the Rebecca Watsons, you have the DJ Grothys, the Ben Radfords. You have all these big name personalities. You have people who are, for lack of a better term, fans of these big personalities. And again, that's only natural, right? I mean, especially, when you're talking about a movement which has really kind of come into its own in the last few years, especially on the secular side of things. The secular demographic is growing by leaps and bounds in this country. The internet, it's just exploded over the last decade or so. So you get these people who are these big personalities, and they have these kind of fan bases, so to speak. And then if you do get these kind of conflicts or these disagreements, especially when they're very public and on the internet, the friends or the fans of one person maybe feel like they need to go to the defense of that person. And when you're dealing with those large groups of people on the internet, there's always going to be those who are going to be a little bit, how shall we say, excessive in their defense of their side or the offense against the other side. And then that just begets, nastiness on the internet and so on and so forth. Now, I think something else is going on here too. I think something else that kind of underlies this, which I think is a deeper point, because a lot of people get caught up in, big personality A versus big personality B, and skeptic number one sucks, but skeptic number two is awesome, and you get into all that stuff. But I think the deeper thing to look at here, and this is something I was looking at a few years ago, and I'm glad I get a chance now to talk about it, is that the skeptical movement, and I'm using air quotes when I say that word, because it is very difficult to kind of get a handle on it, for this very reason, has branched out a huge amount in just the last few years. I mean, there was always sort of the quote traditional skeptical stuff, debunking ghost hunting or going after Bigfoot hunters or UFOlogy and so on and so forth. But because the movement has attracted so many people into it with so many varying interests, a lot of people have been asking questions over recent years about, well, can we apply these ideas of skepticism, critical thinking, and so on and so forth to more than just sort of the traditional boogeymen of skepticism? Can we start to apply these ideas to issues related to, say, feminism or LGBT rights, or social justice issues, or cultural issues, not so much like pure science issues in the traditional sense. So you're seeing this branching out. And some people view that as a negative thing. You get some people, they kind of sit back and go, oh, that skepticism shouldn't be doing that. It should be doing this. But to me, I actually see that as a very positive thing, because what that means is the reason why that's happening is precisely because people are coming into the movement, because you're getting this critical mass, and not everybody wants to do the same thing. Because not everybody wants to do the same thing, they're going out and doing these other things, and I don't view that as a negative at all. I think that's perfectly fine.
I think that's a strength of the diversity of our community, is that we do have these different interests, and this was highlighted by a gentleman that Melissa Lee and I spoke with after one of the panels that you moderated at DragonCon, who really wanted skepticism to just go into UFOs and Bigfoot and the traditional stuff that skepticism has been about for a long time. And it's not that that's going away, but some of the areas that it was exploring these days were not ones that personally resonated with him. It didn't mean that that was a bad thing. And that was part of what we tried to share, is that, of course, with that growth, it's going to go into areas that aren't as meaningful for all of us. It doesn't mean those are wrong and bad. It just means they don't resonate with us.
Yeah, it's just different. And different does not necessarily equate to bad. And I'm glad that you mentioned that, because that's getting into something else that I wanted to make a point of, is that with this kind of branching out of different interests, you're also getting a lot more diversity in the movement. I mean, the movement is way more diverse now than it was, 10, 15, 20 years ago. There's kind of this kind of stereotype that, the movement, 20, 25 years ago started out as, basically as a bunch of old white guys who are kind of, academics or professors or something. The Paul Kurtz model is what I call it. Right. But it's different now. I mean, there are a hell of a lot more young people in the movement who aren't as educated as all those founders were. There's a lot more ethnic diversity. There's a lot more women in the movement. Again, all of those are good things because I don't think we want the movement to be pigeonholed into a particular demographic. But with that diversity comes varying interests, and I think we have to be accepting of that because I mean it's going to happen. It's inevitable.
Well, and I think our technology helps support that because it's not simply the removal of barriers that we may have in, say, academia to ethnic diversity or whatever kind of diversity that we may be talking about. But with the proliferation of social networking, the availability of the internet, those barriers don't exist. They haven't even been erected, let alone have to be taken down. So we're able to see that growth, and that's a terrific thing. That's a strength.
Right. And I think it should also be emphasized that simply because we do have this extra diversity in this and more people interested in looking at these different aspects of critical thinking and skepticism that haven't been traditionally looked at, this doesn't mean that the traditional view of skepticism is going to die. No, not at all. I mean, as a matter of fact, me personally, I'm actually pretty much the example of the old school traditional Paul Kurtz type skeptic because, well, I'm a middle-aged white guy, and I'm also very much an academic. That's what my profession is. That's how I make my living. And I'm working on, of all things, a degree in philosophy now, precisely because I'm interested in these, deep philosophical questions about skepticism and the boundaries between religion and pseudoscience and science and all of these sorts of things. So I'm actually right out of that old school mold, but I don't feel in any way, shape, or form threatened or whatnot because there's a whole bunch of other people that don't want to do what I want to do. So I don't know where that fear, if that is even a real thing, comes from. Maybe in 10 or 20 more years, I'll be like that too. And I'll be turning into that guy, looking at all the young skeptics screaming, "You kids get off my lawn!"
So that's some of the background of this and maybe some of the causes and conditions that we're seeing for these breaks and these divisions that we see. I think you're right, Matt. A lot of this has to do with what our personal interests are. And we see things going in a direction that isn't that, but it doesn't mean that our own direction isn't valid and isn't continuing. And I think that's one of the checks that I find very ironic, that in groups that are very open about being critical thinkers, one of the first things with critical thinking is to check your own biases. And I don't see that happening. And so one of the things I wanted to ask you for your thoughts, and of course I have my own because we run into this with Buddhism as well, that secular Buddhism I see as a growing fourth branch of the Buddhist tree. We have Theravada and Mahayana and Vajrayana, and I do see secular as being distinct from those other three. And the same kinds of divisive ideological conversations that we get into, they can be mutually supportive. And I've been very lucky with this podcast that many of the monastics that I've had on, in fact, I dare say all of them, have been outstanding partners in what we mean by Buddhism, how we communicate that and share that and do these practices in contemporary society, because they all recognize that's not where we grew up. We're not from India of 2,500 years ago. And we see that with other points of view and other ways of knowing the world with skepticism and science. And we see these kinds of divisions come up. And I wanted to hear some of your thoughts on, okay, so we see this happening. We think this is why, some reasons it's happening. Question is, what can we do about it? What can we change to make these breaks, which I think are inevitable? They're part of growth. They're part of the dendrification of a movement. How do we make that less corrosive and self-destructive, as sometimes we do see occur? Are we able to?
I think that's a really great question. And I think it's, first of all, important to acknowledge, like you just did, that these kinds of divisions, if you will, and this kind of branching off and sometimes this kind of conflict, I think in large part this is an inevitability. If you look at the history of all kinds of movements, get away from the skeptics movement, but you just look at any kind of movement, especially political movements, this happens. Once you get enough people involved, you get differing views, and sometimes these divisions form, and sometimes there are schisms and things get nasty. So I think in large part, what we are encountering right now is part of that same phenomenon. And so I do think that there is an aspect to this that is inevitable in that this kind of division or fracturing or branching or whatever term you want to use is going to happen no matter what. But then I think the question of, okay, well, does it have to be constructive or nasty or corrosive or whatever? I think that's where, maybe things come in at the level of the personalities who are involved. Because you can lead by example by being pugilistic. You can put on the gloves and say, let's go at it. And don't get me wrong, I like a good fight as much as the next guy, but there are times when it's not appropriate to do that. And I think that there have been a number of people who are in what we guess we could call leadership type positions, or at least high profile positions within the movement, who they've made some bad decisions in that respect. They've been maybe a little bit more aggressive than perhaps they could have been. Or maybe a better way to say it is they could have made their point without a certain degree of aggression. That's not to say that simply because you're being aggressive to make your point means that your point is wrong. That's not to say that at all, because I personally think that there are some people who have been very aggressive in making their points, but they're perfectly correct. It's also very important to not conflate those two things. Then there are other people who are in those kind of high profile positions who have done a better job, let's say, of being a little trying to make their point, but they're making it in a bit more of a diplomatic way. I think part of this too has to do with, and I know you and I have talked about this before, but I think this is something that people need to understand more widely. Is I think a lot of this has to do with the nature of the internet. I mean, you and I are doing this interview via Skype right now, and we're talking to each other directly, and we can see each other on a video screen. So this is kind of the next best thing to doing it in person. Because when you have a face-to-face conversation with somebody, when you can hear their voice, when you can see their body language, and you're right there with them, that's a different interaction than if you're just, typing words on a keyboard to some avatar on the screen.
Yeah, your entire communication mode changes because instead of, like in this case, me talking with you and seeing your responses, because we're very visual creatures, we read and respond to expressions with amazing degrees of clarity. Even our pets do that. Dogs have a really good sense of when you're in a particular mood. But when we're responding to someone online, we're not really responding to that person. We are typing on a keyboard. We are responding to the machine in front of us, not the person who created the words that in some fashion irked us or that we're responding to. And so it's a greater opportunity for reaction rather than response.
Right. And I think actually maybe another way we could think of that is when you're typing on the keyboard, you're responding to what your perception is of that person.
Yeah, and even worse, it's not even what their intent was. It's your interpretation of it.
Right. You have a perception of who they are or, quote, what they are or whatever. Oh, you're just a troll. And that completely messes up a lot of the communication. And I can see how it can go downhill very quickly. I mean, I've had my fair share of those kinds of interactions on the internet. I think everybody has at this stage. And I think that a lot of people don't take the time to step back and think about this aspect of it, that you can have a conversation with someone with whom you disagree on the internet, and you can be disagreeing, say, argument by blog post or argument by comment thread or however, right? But then you meet that person face to face and you have that same conversation, and it's a completely different conversation in its tone, in its level of civility. And dare I say, you might actually discover that the other person with whom you vehemently disagree is another human being. I know I've had that actually happen to me many times. I've actually run into people with whom I've had these vehement disagreements on the internet and actually had very pleasant, dare I say, civil conversations with them. I think it's something that some of these people in the high-profile positions in the skeptic movement or the leadership, if you want to call it that way, I think this is a failing on the part of some of those people, because I know for a fact that some of these people who have had these disagreements, they've been at the same event at the same time, for instance. They've been in attendance, but even though they're having this semi-vicious fight on the internet or whatever, they're not sitting down and taking the time to actually talk to each other directly, or they're not picking up the phone and calling it. And that is unfortunate. Now, having said that, I will say that I do know of one instance where actually it was done, in my opinion, the right way. There were a couple of people at TAM a couple of years ago who they got into a big disagreement. It kind of turned into a little blog war and everything. And then a third party who knew both of them stepped in and said, "Look, you two are being silly about this. You need to get on the phone and talk to each other." And this third party facilitated that discussion, and the two people involved actually did. They actually did talk to each other, not by internet, but they got on the phone. They spoke to each other, and once they were able to do that and kind of hash things out, at the conclusion of this series of communications, and it wasn't just one conversation, it was many, they both came to the conclusion that, well, holy crap, we were basically saying the same thing, but because we were each getting caught up in all of this mess out there on the internet, we were completely missing the point that the other person was trying to make. And now that we get to talk together, we actually kind of agree, and there we go. And the nice thing about that is, up until that point, there were all kinds of people on the internet, the people that that love the conflict. They just want to see bombs thrown and stuff, right? And so they egg it on. They were using this situation as a mechanism for that. And then when these two people came out publicly and said, "Yeah, we talked about it, and actually, no, this is good," then all of those bomb throwers, they had to go somewhere else because they didn't have anything to hang their hat on anymore. And it ended up being a really good situation. And I think that something like that could serve as a model for a lot of this stuff. Now, I'm not going to say that, you're going to get people, walking around holding hands singing Kumbaya or anything, but you don't necessarily have to like someone to work with them. I think that's maybe a good general way of thinking about the stuff. Because I've worked with people in the skeptic movement that I don't like personally, but you kind of, if it's something you really want to do, you kind of swallow it and you move on. I mean,
I think this brings up a couple very good points, is that regardless of how things have gone in the past, and bear in mind I conclude every podcast with this, every moment you have a choice, make it the best you can. And we understand that we can't always make good choices, and we don't. That's perfectly human. We're not expecting people to be perfect. But if things have gone badly, you just had a wonderful example of how people were able to make a choice and say, hang on, let's just pause for a minute, set aside some of our biases. And you need to intentionally do that and listen to the other. And that can turn things around, particularly when we do things through a bit better of a communication media, either face-to-face, I think would be best. And sometimes if we can have cameras or by phone, something where we get a little more personal in these discussions, that can be very helpful. One of the things I wanted to mention, I know you and I have particular thoughts on this, is that there is also the opinion out there, and it is one with which I disagree, that we need people to be very aggressive, because that also draws attention, and we do piss people off enough sometimes that they do their checking and they change their minds. And I will say, yes, absolutely. Sometimes that does occur. What I find difficult to resonate with that as a long-term strategy is that it tends to ignore the many, 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 many other people who are turned off by that aggression on the other side of whatever the disagreement is, that because of a splashback effect, you've now made them more entrenched in their views, and they will not listen to people that they otherwise would have listened to because you've irritated them enough that they've shut down now. Have you seen that kind of thing happen as well?
I do think you need the aggressive voices in moderation. The problem is that you need to have a balance. And I think that what happens is that you have people, the quote fan base or whatever, if you wish, who, for whatever reason, they want nothing but the aggression, right? Now, you get somebody like PZ Myers, and maybe that's his style. He's the aggressive type, and then you have maybe, say, in terms of personality, on the other end, you've got like perfect example. It's Eugenie Scott, and she is not the aggressive type. She is very diplomatic, but she's also very passionate and firm in her beliefs and whatnot. But she's just got a very sort of opposite style than PZ tends to have. And I can see how you can need both. But I think the problem comes in that you get kind of the fan base effect where you get the people who only want the aggressive style, or they only want the other style, or they only want this, or they only want that. And so that's all they want to see. When in reality, I think, there are times you need all of that. And there are a lot of people, I think, that understand that, but I think there's also a lot of people that don't understand that. They kind of find their favorite style when they say, yeah, this has got to be the way it's got to be all the time. And it's like, no, it's like know your audience, right? I mean, you can't necessarily use the same pitch, so to speak, with every audience. It's going to be depend. How you present a topic is going to be dependent upon what your audience is like.
One of the things I would suggest is something to consider for folks who are on the more aggressive side is that perhaps it's not anger or aggression that will be as effective as maintaining that passion. Passion is terrific and I think is much more likely to open someone else's mind to what you're having to say, because people do respect passion, even if they disagree with the views. They understand that you're more sincere about it. The aggression, not so much. I don't think that works quite as well as passion does.
Much of the time, if you're aggressive with somebody, they will just, again, this is part of just who we are. You'll have people who will have a fight or flight response. You get aggressive with somebody, they have a fight or flight response, and if they want to engage, they'll fight, and then it gets nasty. If they don't want to engage, they're like, well, you're just a jerk, and they leave. That tends to be what most people do. I would say that there are some people who maybe need that aggression as a way of getting them to see something they wouldn't otherwise see. But again, if you're going to use that aggression, you need to make sure you target it to the right audience. It's kind of like thinking that the only tool in your toolbox is a hammer.
Right. And everything looks like a nail.
Yeah, and everything looks like a nail. And no, you can't use a hammer on everything. Sometimes you need the screwdriver. Sometimes you need a pair of pliers. You got all these other tools. But yeah, sometimes you need the hammer. Sometimes you just need to break something with the hammer. But it's not the only tool in the toolbox, and I think that that's something that some people kind of they lose sight of because they really like the hammer.
So let's wrap this up by looking at what is it we can do about it. We've identified, yes, there's a problem here, and some of the causes and conditions that may contribute to it. So what are the opportunities? What are the things that we can do about it? I have some of my own thoughts on that, but I want to hear from you. What are some of the things you think people can do differently?
I think part of it is we just at one level have to acknowledge that sometimes these things happen. Like I said, there's an aspect of this that I think is inevitable. And I think part of the thing that a lot of people are struggling with, because I've had a lot of conversations with people, or I've seen a lot of conversations online where a lot of people are like, oh, so and so is trying to destroy skepticism, or this is horrible. The skeptical movement is splintering, and this and that. And I think what those people are thinking is they're thinking that, they have this vision in their mind of what the skeptical movement should be, and it's not necessarily the realistic vision because it kind of places all of these people, all these personalities on a pedestal and doesn't acknowledge that they're real human beings. And I think that one of the things that can be done is just to try to get people to understand that the reality is that we're just as human as everybody else, and we're subject to all these same kinds of things, and then in many ways this is this sort of stuff that just tends to happen. And I think if we can get more people to understand that point, then a good deal of anxiety will go away. Now, as far as other things, lessening corrosive conversation and furthering constructive conversation, I think that it would be good for more people to try to engage with somebody with whom they disagree, but to do it in a different medium than just, your flame wars on the comment threads or whatever. To, maybe consider following the example that I mentioned before of these two personalities, well-known personalities in the skeptic movement, who actually were able to swallow their pride a bit and have a conversation over the phone with each other in order to actually try to see where the other was coming from. And I think that if we can encourage people to think of the person with whom they disagree as not just an avatar on a screen and words that are appearing on my computer screen, but to understand that there is an actual person, an actual human, just like yourself, on the other side of that, and try to put yourself in those shoes and just develop that awareness, I think that can go a long way. Now, that is easier said than done, to say the least, because I'm certainly not the first person to say this. As a matter of fact, I know I'm not the first person to say this. Maybe I am on this podcast, but I know that there have been plenty of other people who are much wiser than me who have been saying things like this for years. But I think that is probably a good starting point. And sometimes I think we have to acknowledge that that does mean putting yourself into a position where maybe you're a little uncomfortable. Maybe you have, maybe you're pushing your comfort zone a little bit. Like, for example, at DragonCon's last Labor Day weekend, I ran a couple of panels in the skeptic track. And I won't name names, but you and I discussed that there's somebody on those panels that, I personally did not get along with this person, for my own personal reasons. But you know what? I was sitting there and I was thinking, okay, I acknowledge that, but at the same time, I acknowledge that they have a contribution to make in this discussion. So bring them on, and let's have that discussion. And it ended up being a very positive thing. And it was universally acknowledged as positive. And people coming up and afterwards just saying, "Oh, it was an amazing panel," and all this stuff. And that's, I think that's good, because I think we can also do ourselves a great service by kind of acknowledging that, yes, I can work with somebody who's not necessarily, quote, my friend or somebody I like. I mean, I think we have to sometimes bear that aspect of things in mind too. Yeah, hang out and have fun with the people that you like who are your friends, but also, if you're doing this skeptic stuff on a professional or a semi-professional level, let's also acknowledge the other aspect of it too, that sometimes you're going to end up working with people with whom you disagree and maybe you personally don't like. And that's kind of the nature of the beast. So I don't know if that answered the question or not.
It does. There was a couple of ideas around how we can better accommodate different views and the natural growth of things, which is sometimes difficult and I think is inevitable. And there are different communications, not only different communication styles that we can employ, but different media. And the thing that I find very helpful in this, in my own difficulties in communicating with others, is that this isn't something that we can just do well because we know it's a good idea. This is something we need to practice. And for me, this is the appeal of the kinds of practices we do in secular Buddhism and mindfulness and these mindful dialogues, is that gives us that opportunity to really have a system and an embedded process that proliferates and becomes more common in our lives, by which we do check our biases. We do put on the brakes for a moment, and we know that we may be perfectly right, but we can also have the attitude of, I could be wrong, and I don't know what the other person's experience is, and I do need to understand that. And that can be a sincere engagement and sincere listening to what they have to say, without always immediately taking and discounting everything the other says by our own template, because we're not the other person. And that's not easy to do. In fact, that's one of the hardest things we can do because it's so embedded in our character. So it's an ongoing practice, and of course on on this particular podcast, one of the things we're about is practice. So of course it's the word's going to get out here. Hey, yeah, there are things we can do. I don't know how that's going to fit into other areas. And I think time will tell. I think your best statement came from earlier on in the discussion, where it's about how we model the behavior, how we can lead by example. And leaders are not always those who are in the leadership positions. Every one of us has that opportunity to lead by providing that example.
I think that's a good point.
Our guest today has been Matt Lowry. Matt blogs as a skeptical teacher, and he currently is the record holder for returns to the secular Buddhist. I think this is number 4. Congratulations. Your trophy is on the way.
Awesome.
Matt, thanks for being here. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Ted.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.